Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation, a research-driven approach to engage and keep top talent. This event is part of SHRM's webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand programs from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks today's program sponsor, ITA Group, for helping make this webcast available to the HR community. In today's program, you are going to hear about a landmark study about the impact social psychology can have on employee engagement, including how a psychology-based strategy more effectively retains talent. Today's program will be led by Christina Zurich from ITA Group. Here's some background on our speaker. Christina Zurich, SHRM SCP, is the Insights and Strategy Leader at ITA Group. In this role, she directs the vision, position, and evolution of the Employee Experience Solution portfolio. Ms. Zurich leverages her passion for motivating and engaging people alongside more than 10 years of consultative solution visioning and development experience to craft compelling strategies for clients in all industry verticals. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Ms. Christina Zurich.
Thank you very much, Mike, and welcome everybody to today's webcast. As Mike said, I am thrilled to be here representing ITA Group, an organization that really works with our clients to identify how best to motivate and engage their people to drive results. I'm so happy to be here today to share our recent research on employee engagement and specifically what we believe organizations need to do to retain the critical top talent that they'll need for long-term success. I will start today off by just providing a little bit more background, including why I believe we need to keep talking about employee engagement. There's a concerning trend going on where people are starting to give up, I think, and I think now is actually the time we need to double down more than ever. And specifically, I'll share why this belief has really led us to the point of having this research that we'll end up spending the bulk of our time on today. I'll share details about what the research tells us is happening with engagement today, but really want to dig into what we call the psychological benefit framework. It's an approach that we've uncovered that we believe is really an entirely different way of evaluating engagement for companies. We'll cover how specific programs or initiatives impact these psychological benefits, as well as share a few actionable takeaways that I think that will help you leverage these insights moving forward. As Mike said, we definitely have reserved time so that we can have a good Q&A session around this. So as you have questions arise as I walk through this, please make sure to submit those through that Q&A form so that we can go ahead and round out the discussion by answering exactly what it is that you're wondering about. There's only so much that I can cover in this amount of time, so I'll do my best to get to everybody's questions. So with that, let's go ahead and dig in. ITA Group is an engagement agency that's been in the business of engaging and educating people and reinforcing motivation for the past 50 years. In recent years, we've expanded our capabilities through two strategic acquisitions, Chadwick Martin Bailey, or CMB, an award-winning market research firm based out of Boston, who you'll hear more about here in a minute, and then also Hartman Studios, an experiential marketing firm based in San Francisco. In my role, specifically as an Insights and Strategy Leader, I really spend my time doing a lot of research to better understand and forecast the business and market trends that we believe impact the clients we work with every day. Then I work closely with a lot of different people within our organization to calibrate our offering to make sure that we can fit those needs and keep up with those changes that you all are dealing with. Honestly, it's a really cool industry to be a part of. It's one that I didn't really realize existed until I was lucky enough to find my way here about 9 years ago. But at the end of the day, what I love most about it is that I can take pride in knowing that my larger purpose is all about helping employees around the world feel happier, more connected, and more appreciated for the thing that they do more than most anything else in their lives, which is work. I'm lucky because it's easy for me to connect to that larger purpose. But I recognize that not everybody is always able to do that, or maybe not as easily at least. But I'm thankful for more than just the work that I do each day. Because as much as that purpose matters, and as much as I love making people happier doing what they do at work, and I would never say it doesn't that's not the only thing that drives me. In fact, for me, a lot of it comes down to the people that I work with, the culture that we have inside of our walls at ITA, and the relationships that I've built over time. And that's ultimately what makes me an engaged employee. And so as much as the stats on engagement would make you feel like I'm an outlier and perhaps broad engagement isn't possible anymore, I disagree. I strongly disagree. Because I think that when organizations put focused effort forth to nurture that culture and to create that community and to instill that sense of shared purpose for their people, engagement is possible. And it's the reason that I still believe in pursuing it, is really validated by data that shows us that when employees are engaged, it matters, and it gets incredible results, just a few of the ones you see on screen here per Gallup. But unfortunately, I'm also a realist, and my research has taught me that, stats like this, they're not the norm for most of today's organizations. In fact, consider that just about 15% of employees worldwide are considered highly engaged. Trust levels are pretty dismal. Less than half of global professionals actually say that they trust those who they work with and for. There's kind of a pervasive disconnect between image and reality that we see going on in the market as well. So less than 20% of employees who were recently surveyed feel that what they were pitched as their work experience externally during the recruiting process is what they actually experience day to day in the job. And because of all of this, advocacy or willingness for an employee to go out of their way to recommend the organization to others is increasingly difficult. In fact, just 25% of employees would recommend their organization to others. So what's causing this? Well, I think part of the issue is that almost half of employees don't feel like they can actually be their authentic selves due to a lack of inclusion in the workplace. But it's bigger than that. And the good news is, I think other people are recognizing that too. And so this stat here is my silver lining. And it's that just 22% of executives surveyed believe that they've created an excellent and differentiated employee experience brand. And it's really this awareness that is the foundation of why I think it's so important to continue to fight to find better ways to engage employees. Because we know that as much as we're all trying, we're still missing something. And that's really what started all of this. Basically, it was a relentless insistence that there has to be a better way to actually engage and retain people. So, what have I learned so far? I've got good news, and then I've got not so good news. Well, let's start with the good. So, first of all, I think companies are trying really hard to get inside their employees' heads and hearts to figure this out. They're doing it by seeking out ways to learn what's working and what isn't for other companies, including doing things like attending webcasts like this. So I want you to know how much I value the work that all of you are doing just by continuing to look into this, continuing to evaluate what it is that you do. But I also think that companies are spending a lot of money to unravel this engagement mystery as well. Upwards of $18 billion based on one of the latest reports I heard from Josh Bersin. And that money is going to a lot of different places and a lot of different things, different programs and initiatives, including, today some of the trendier ones are free food or on-site conveniences like dry cleaning or daycare, game rooms, social activities, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But it's also coming through lifestyle adjustments and overall increasing flexibility that companies are willing to offer to their workers, which can come at a cost as well. So think about the increased prevalence of remote work options, sabbatical offers, or even bringing your pet to work policies. And all of these things totally make sense on the surface, because who doesn't think that things like working from home in pajamas or bringing your dog to the office and eating free food sounds great? And here's the thing, those things are great, and anybody who's experienced them generally will agree, though I have seen some mixed opinions as it relates to the bring your pet to work policy. But what we have found is that never in the history of mankind has an issue as emotional and nuanced as engagement been solved by food, dogs, or pajamas. And as our research helped us to validate, we can't expect it to, because no matter how good the food might be, it's just not tapping into what really matters to people. See, there's more social psychology that goes into this engagement thing than all of us, myself included, ever realized. And those strategies While they seem really appealing, only scratch the surface of what it really takes to captivate and ultimately retain your people. So for example, let's look at me. Remember how I talked about how working for my company makes me feel, and the purpose that I have in what I do, and how it's the people and the community and the connection that ultimately makes me engaged? Well, what I didn't mention was that I get to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, and then I didn't mention my casual dress code even when I'm at the office, and I didn't even mention that I'm planning for my sabbatical in the spring. But what I spoke to was deeply rooted in the way I identify, socially, culturally, and personally with the company, my colleagues, and the work that I do. And now, through our research, we can help leaders like you understand what you need to accomplish on a psychological level to make that kind of sustainable engagement inside of your walls as well. So it's not rocket science, but engagement is more nuanced than even I ever imagined. And so after years of seeing flailing engagement levels, our hypothesis as a team was that something was broken, that we needed to help companies find a way to actually connect more deeply than these trendy surface-level solutions so that people can stop gravitating toward those and finally start making some focused decisions on what will ultimately benefit their organization the most. But to test our theory, we knew we needed data and facts. It wasn't enough to just go off of a gut feeling, because that's honestly what I think a lot of us have been doing for a long time. And so we realized that it would take a great deal of research, some help from a brilliant social psychologist who we partnered with, and a lot of rolling up our sleeves to try to figure out what truly is at play. What are those factors that ultimately make a person engaged in what it is that they do for their company? So I mentioned that you would hear about Chadwick Martin Bailey again, or CMB. This is that market research firm that is our research arm based out in Boston, and we tapped into them. Our first step was to reach out and to say, we need help figuring this out. What can your team do? And so we are super excited to share the results of that collaborative project with you today, and hope that at the end of our time together, you too will have a clearer understanding of how psychology complements and can drive engagement without actually having to go take some psychology classes. I can't tell you how valuable it was to have an expert help guide us through this process, and I think we've been able to uncover some really exciting things. So with that, let's go ahead and dig into the research itself. So our goal for the project that we agreed on was pretty direct. We wanted to develop a deep, unique, and actionable understanding of what actually motivates and retains employees. And I will tell you now that we at ITA were intentionally very distant during this process. We basically agreed on the objective, agreed on the overall approach for the research project, and then took a big step back because we knew how passionate we were about the topic. And we knew that that could be actually a challenge for us instead of an opportunity. We didn't want our past experience or our own previously held beliefs to color the research to the point where it wouldn't be something new and it wouldn't be something different. And so for us, being able to maintain that objectivity for CMB was of paramount importance. Plus, regardless of the outcome, I just wanted to know what worked. Even if it came out that we had been doing things all wrong, or maybe we were doing things all right and it still wasn't working. It was the process that was most important to me, and knowing that we could trust those results. So CMB then moved on to field a research panel of nearly 1,500 employees in mid to large size organizations across 9 key industries. Their roles, tenure, levels, and other demographics within the sample set were varied to ensure as many different views into the data as possible while still remaining statistically significant. And the survey was pretty rigorous. It wasn't just your standard one. It was 74 questions and took on average over 20 minutes to complete. And it was long because, as you can see, we covered a lot of ground. The topics were selected by CMB based on understanding the psychology of what drives decision-making in all people. This was not specific just to traditional recognition and engagement efforts. So things like emotion, maintaining self-esteem, a sense of purpose, social belonging, feelings control, accomplishment, all of those things, but in addition to some of the standard, more tangible motivators like money. And so what did these people tell us about engagement? What did we learn? As we expected, at the highest level, our findings validate the importance of employee engagement and support the research you're likely reading about, including, unfortunately, some of those dismal stats that I referenced a bit ago. So here we can see that employees who are satisfied at their company, in the blue bars, are compared to employees who are dissatisfied, in the orange. And you can see that satisfied employees are much more likely to advocate or be willing to speak out positively on behalf of their company by recommending it as a good place to work. They're also much more likely to be thinking long-term about their future with the company. And finally, as we look to the uncertain future of work and what that will look and feel like for people, it's notable that they're also much more willing to go outside of their comfort zone for their company by learning new skills or taking on new responsibilities. And as a whole, they're significantly less likely to be leaving. So whether that's casually exploring jobs at other companies, kind of the gateway, or flat out admitting that they don't anticipate being with the company for another year. In both cases, they were much less likely to report doing so if they were satisfied. And then we noticed something really interesting that you'll hear about several times throughout this presentation as it resurfaces in a few different ways. So when we look at satisfaction through the lens of employee tenure, you'll see an interesting trend emerge. Look at where the dissatisfaction peaks, that orange line, in the 1 to 2 year range. This is also tied for the lowest point of satisfaction, blue bars. So this trend is so prevalent where we see this dip in engagement that we coined a name for it. We call it the reality slump, and it's as bad as it sounds. Basically, this is a critical juncture when employees exit what we would consider to be the proverbial honeymoon stage and become most vulnerable to disengagement. It typically occurs among employees with 1 to 2 years of tenure, and was seen across every variable we tested. Notice, too, that while they do recover, it often takes until somewhere after the 10-year tenure mark to recover to year 1 satisfaction levels. So given what we know about how long most employees stay with an organization, and that it's commonly somewhere between 2 to 4 years, depending on the research you're reading, that time that it takes to recover is pretty dissettling. So you actually see the reality slump kick in as it relates to advocacy too. We wanted to look both at satisfaction, which I would consider to be important, but I think we all know that a satisfied employee is not necessarily also going to be willing to go out and speak positively on behalf of your company. And that's why we really dug into advocacy as well. And you see it manifest again, right there in that 1 to 2 year range, where unlikeliness to be an advocate peaks and where likeliness to be an advocate is at one of the lowest levels it hits. Before I round out our high-level findings on the state of engagement based on our research, I'd like to take a moment for an audience poll. So I am curious to hear from you at this point, based on what I've shared about the reality slump. Is this something that you think is an issue for your organization? We've got a poll available for you to submit your response, and we'll give you all a minute to complete that. All right, let's take a look at where we're coming in. All right, so we are fairly evenly split. It looks like about half of you are definitely feeling the pain. This is probably ringing a few bells as it relates to what you guys are experiencing. And over 40% are also questioning whether or not it's something that you should look into. Less than 10% are saying that it is not an issue for your organization. So to those lucky few, I think that's awesome to hear. I would love to talk more with you about how it is that you're keeping those engagement levels so consistent. But for the others, fear not. You're not alone. This is something that, as I said, we saw throughout the research. So let's keep moving, and you'll learn some additional information about how we can help to mitigate the impact of that challenging trend. So as a whole, I would say that our research really indicates that existing employee satisfaction and engagement levels are low and cause for concern. For example, we found that only a third of employees say that they're very satisfied with their company. Almost half are interested in exploring jobs at other companies, and over half plan to leave the company they're at eventually. A third say that they'll actually leave within 12 months. So, what do we do with that? What actually does keep employees satisfied and engaged at their organization? That was our next question, because we refused to let this research simply end up in a bunch more dismal engagement statistics. So, in the research, people were asked about more than just common engagement questions. This was to get to the deeper layer of psychology at work. And as a result, we found that there are 3 types of factors that are key to driving employee engagement, which we call psychological benefits. There are 3 distinct types, which include functional benefits, or things that a person wants to accomplish or do, and specifically how the company helps them do so. Emotional benefits, or the way that people want to feel day-to-day working at the company. And identity benefits, or who a person wants to be, and specifically what they feel working for the company says about them. So consistently, we found that when a company effectively nurtures these psychological benefits, employees are more satisfied and more willing to be advocates. So that's great. With our end goal being, though, to better understand how to engage and retain key people, this was really a key milestone for us. We knew that we were onto something. But this only got us partway to what we wanted, because we also needed to understand which psychological benefits carry the most impact, so that ultimately we could get to that point of helping clients feel like they had an actionable path forward. And so for that, we wanted to better understand with predictive models the relative contribution of each psychological benefit. So which one is most important? And here you see the model results, which show that relative importance of each psychological benefit in predicting employee advocacy, which is what we used as our proxy for engagement. The importance scores are calibrated so that the most important benefit, personal identity benefits, get a score of 100, and everything else is scored relative to that. You might be wondering why we all of a sudden have 5 bars instead of 3. And that's because the identity benefits are particularly complex, and they actually break apart into 3 subtypes: personal identity benefits, cultural identity benefits, and social identity benefits. The key takeaway here is that personal identity benefits are the single most important driver of engagement, but emotions are also very important as well. I'm going to get a little bit stats heavy even for me, so hopefully you follow along with me. But what I want you to know is how confident we are in this model. And so to ensure that we were really comfortable with where we landed, we used regression models that found that taken together, these 5 psychological benefits explain nearly 70% of the variance in employee engagement. That's really high. As I'm sure you can all appreciate, humans' behavior, or the reasons why people do what they do, can be really hard to understand and even harder to predict. Turns out we're pretty squirrely. And so the analysts on this project are actually normally thrilled to have 50% of variance explained. So to reach 70% was amazing. I think they're still smiling ear to ear. So clearly, these psychological benefits are very important to employees. Let's take some time now to walk through each of the psychological benefits in detail so that you can have a little bit more definition around what each of them actually mean tactically, as well as some of the key insights that we found through our research relative to each one. First up are functional benefits, and I'm starting with this one because I think it's honestly where most companies have started with their engagement efforts, and some haven't progressed beyond this point with their engagement efforts historically. Remember those tread me perks I mentioned earlier? Much of those fall into this category. Companies pursue functional benefits through initiatives like compensation, training, work-life balance policies, and some of those perks as well: on-site conveniences, dry cleaning, free food. The list goes on and on. But based on the predictive model that I just showed you, we know that functional benefits are actually kind of middle of the road in terms of how much they contribute to engagement. Only about half of total engagement, actually. So we believe that they're considered cost of entry. Basically, you need them to be competitive to get people in the door, but none of these things are what will actually retain and engage people long term. Interestingly, we did see that there were some disparities between genders when it came to the functional benefit space. For example, women surveyed didn't have higher satisfaction ratings on any functional benefit than men. And differences among generations were particularly pronounced as well. So you'll notice here that millennials in blue were the least satisfied of all generations across the board. Gen X was consistently the most satisfied in orange. At this point, I want to move on into emotional benefits. And what we mean by these is really it's digging into worker sentiment and the impact of emotion, both positive and negative. This is a well-researched aspect of organizational culture. It's not that it's something that's never been discussed. In fact, it's often referred to as emotional culture, and it's been proven to impact employee satisfaction, burnout, team effectiveness, and even hard measures like financial performance and absenteeism. And so the way that we wanted to account for emotional culture in our research was via emotional benefits. So for us, this is all about evaluating the typical workday feelings, both positive and negative, that employees have. Our approach to measuring this takes into account both how good and bad the feelings are, but also how strongly they're felt. What we found were several interesting trends. So we see the greatest degree of volatility, meaning the highest incidence of positive emotions and also the highest incidence of negative emotions from executive-level respondents. Honestly, I think this is somewhat understandable given the pressure involved in that type of role. Overall, though, I've got to say that the research validated for me that there's still so much that can and should be done for today's workforce. When you look at these other stats that are on screen, it's understandable why we see the retention and engagement challenges we do when, on a day-to-day basis, people are feeling undervalued, disconnected, and unsupported. I think there's a lot more that we can be doing, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see the work being done in the industry as it relates to emotional intelligence, having more of those hard conversations, but I think there's definitely room for improvement based on what we saw through our research. I will say that tenure was a particularly affecting variable for emotional benefits. So we see that reality slump back in full swing with the psychological benefit, but the impact of positive emotions actually manifests more fully during the 3 to 6 year tenure range versus the earlier onset that we saw when looking at engagement, advocacy, and even some of the other psychological benefits that I'll cover with you. The good news, though, is that with time, these emotions tend to regulate, becoming more positive, the green lines, while simultaneously decreasing incidence of negative emotions in red. So I don't want this to feel like the reality slump is such a dismal, dark message that is bringing everybody down. It tends to do that when I'm talking to people about it. What I want you to know is it is a dark period for employees when they're going through it, but in almost all cases, they recover. So try to keep that light in mind as we continue to walk through these so that it doesn't get too heavy. All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and transition into those identity benefits. The identity benefits, as I said, were particularly complex, and so there are 3 different subtypes that are interrelated but separate. So those include cultural, social, and personal. Cultural identity really explores what a person thinks about the way things are done in an organization, including how consistent they believe the culture is and whether or not they like that culture. We found that broadly, despite the heavy focus that companies are placing on cultural initiatives, employees aren't necessarily feeling that positive impact. That said, I will note that respondents in the tech and financial industries were among the most satisfied with their cultures. We also found that tenure and level of respondent were heavily impacting variables. Unsurprisingly, I would say the higher your level within an organization, the more likely you were to believe that the culture was clear and to also like it. I want to dig a little bit deeper, though, into tenure. As you can tell, this is a passion topic of mine. And we see a pretty exaggerated reality slump take place in the first 1 to 2 years as it relates to cultural clarity. So again, that's how clear is the culture? How consistent is it? This drops 17 percentage points abruptly and actually doesn't fully recover to year 1 levels at all. So we believe that companies are doing more work than ever to publicly promote an appealing employer brand image, but perhaps maybe an underlying driver of this disconnect is that the reality of what employees experience once they join might be a little inconsistent with that projected image. I think it's also very likely that in this age of having rampant M&A activity, it is likely that that is causing further cultural erosion or difficulties in terms of maintaining that cultural consistency. A couple different factors at play there. Social identity really starts to explore an employee's interpersonal experience. So that digs into things like the relatability of both leaders and peers, as well as an individual's interest in developing friendships at work. I think this is an increasingly important component of organizational culture as we see increased loneliness on a global scale. I'm sure you guys have seen some of the research out there. Given that many people spend more time at work than in any other setting, their ability to forge these social bonds are significant drivers of their overall connection to the organization. And unsurprisingly, based on the personal nature of the psychological benefit, we found that this was actually one of the more polarizing benefits depending on profile factors, like whether or not they were managers, whether or not they were highly tenured, and then also their level within the organization. When looking more closely at the survey respondents' interest in making friends with both the typical executive and employee, I don't actually think it's all that surprising to see what we do here, which is basically they're not as interested in making friends with executives versus their peers. I don't think that we'll ever probably get to a point where those are even, but I do think the particularly steep decline in interest in connecting more with executives during that reality slump period is notable, as is the minimal improvement we see for long term. So there's definitely something that appears to be consistently happening that basically is impacting the image and relatability of senior level leaders within an organization from that time of starting to that kind of 1 to 2 year range and ongoing really from that point on. All right, finally, I have saved the most important psychological benefit for last, personal identity. In addition to being the most important driver of engagement, which is reason alone to hopefully recall it, science also tells me that you're most likely to retain the last thing that I tell you. So here's hoping that that's still the case. Personal identity, as its name indicates, is a deeply personal psychological benefit that's really rooted in an employee's feelings of self-esteem, pride, and overall connection to a larger purpose. And as a result, I believe it can actually be one of the hardest ones to outwardly detect among employees unless you really know what signs to look for. Now, considering the impact of this psychological benefit, I'll be honest, it's clear from these summary findings on screen that a focused effort needs to be put forth toward both helping to identify those team members who are having struggles with these personal identity variables, as well as nurturing personal identity in employees. Broadly, more than 1 in 3 employees report that they don't feel good about themselves for the work they do, and they aren't proud to share where they work. That was a pretty jarring message to uncover in the data, and I'll be honest, it doesn't get any easier to share no matter how many times I've reviewed these findings with people. We see the reality slump is again present when evaluating personal identity, particularly when looking at the variables of pride and self-esteem. Though we do see a little bit of a delay in terms of where that self-esteem bottoms out before starting to recover. It's worth noting that neither pride nor self-esteem ever actually recover to those year one levels. So given the importance of personal identity benefits, we explored it from a variety of different angles to really better understand what drives it. Notable secondary level findings include that people managers are much more likely to feel good about themselves versus individual contributors. As level within the company elevates, so too does self-esteem. Client-facing roles are significantly more likely to have higher self-esteem. And finally, males tend to be more likely to have higher self-esteem than females. But what was perhaps most interesting to me was that the variables of generation and income level didn't significantly impact self-esteem and pride to the degree that one might expect. So this really validates, I think, that the psychological benefit of personal identity is largely impacted by the role a person plays within the organization versus some of the traditional demographics that we would normally be able to break down. All right, I have thrown a lot at you so far, so I want to take another minute to break for a poll question. And I'm super curious, based on kind of this high-level introduction I've provided to each of these psychological benefits, if you had to guess which are broadly affecting your organization, which would you choose? You can select as many as you think are applicable. We'll go ahead and give half a minute or so for everybody to get their responses in. Wow, pretty even distribution. So it looks like the leader is cultural, followed closely by personal and emotional, then functional and social at the end. Very interesting. All right, so we have covered the psychological benefit framework, but I guess that you are probably feeling this way right now. What do we do with that? Yeah, that's different. I haven't really looked at it through that type of a process before. And we asked ourselves the same thing. And so as we planned our research, I mentioned that we knew we wanted to also be able to understand the role that engagement initiatives played because we wanted to be able to make actionable recommendations for clients. And so knowing that, we wanted to make sure that we could help them do that. And so at the end of the day, we still agree that it's great that companies are doing so much to improve engagement, but often they just don't know what's working and what's not, and need help focusing and prioritizing to figure out what exactly makes the most sense for their unique organization. So to tactically understand how companies can support those psychological benefits, we first needed to get a better understanding of how employees see the different kinds of initiatives that companies can pursue outside of more traditional compensation types of packages. So we asked them about more than 20 different things that a company can offer, just a few of which you see on here, ensuring that we asked if they do have or would like to have the various initiatives in place. And once we collected all of that feedback, we factor analyzed the range of the company initiatives we tested using measures of basically how much employees do or would appreciate each one to help us prioritize. And so by doing that, we found that from employees' point of view, there are 6 primary types of engagement initiatives: company communications, company-sponsored events, recognition programs, incentive programs, professional development programs, and wellness programs. Interestingly, we found that a lot of employees say that their companies provide these. So it's not necessarily that we've been choosing the wrong types of things to offer. Instead, it actually appears to be an issue with just how effective these initiatives are. So, for example, 80% of people say that their company has a recognition program that you can see on screen, but only 34% say that the company has a recognition program that they actually like. So, appears to be a disconnect. So why does this matter? At the end of the day, why does knowing that they don't necessarily like them matter to us? Well, it's because our research shows that when companies provide these kinds of initiatives in ways that satisfy their employees, it makes a difference. So what you're looking at here shows us the difference in overall employee satisfaction when a company when an employee believes that an initiative is good or not. So for example, if a company has company communications that are highly effective, they are likely to have about 87% employee satisfaction, versus if the company communications are not very effective, satisfaction would be about 26%. So you can see that on average, employees tend to be 2 to 3 times more satisfied when each of these individual initiatives is more effective. So that tells us that when these are well done, they're effective retention tools for employees. But why is that? Like, what is it about these that are making initiatives work? What is it that employees are experiencing that makes them like it versus not like it? Well, that's where we come back to those psychological benefits. So to understand how the different types of initiatives work, we ran what's called a path analysis, looking at the interrelationships between the 6 types of company initiatives on the left, the 5 psychological benefits in the middle, and the desired outcome, which is employee engagement. And this is a schematic of the results, which helps us understand that those 5 psychological benefits together mediate how engagement initiatives ultimately impact engagement, as well as that an employee's satisfaction with an engagement initiative is a sign that it's successfully delivering on one or more of these psychological benefits. This is a little overwhelming, I know, so why don't we take it piece by piece? Through this schematic, we can see that company communications, events, and recognition have a direct impact on cultural and social identity benefits. Events, recognition, and incentive programs have a direct impact on personal identity benefits. And recognition, incentives, and professional development programs are what will directly impact functional benefits. Emotional benefits are a little bit unique because those are actually driven through the other 4 types of psychological benefits. So in other words, when you do a good job of meeting the needs of the identity benefits and the functional benefits, you'll see an improvement in emotional benefits. Interestingly, you may have noticed that wellness programs are kind of hanging out here on the side, the far left side. And that's because we found that they have a more indirect effect on employee engagement than other initiative types. I'd like to spend a minute explaining that. So the number of companies offering health and wellness programs is on the rise. Clearly, there's a belief that investing in employees' health and wellness will pay off in their commitment to the organization, and maybe even their ability to manage stress and be productive if we're lucky. But in terms of employee engagement, our results actually suggest that while wellness programs work, it's because they're seen as providing what other types of initiatives offer. So for example, they might be feeling like a recognition or incentive to an employee. So as a result, it makes it likely much more sense for companies to choose one of the 5 primary engagement initiatives with a more direct impact on the psychological benefits that they want to improve. It'll just be more efficient in the long run. Now, as you can imagine, the combination of initiatives that are right for each company will really depend on that company's relative strengths and weaknesses in delivering on each of these psychological benefits. And that's because each of these initiatives is effective at improving certain psychological benefits. What we did see, though, is that when engagement initiatives are delivered in combination, they can be especially impactful. And this is because each initiative attends to a unique subset of psychological benefits. So here's an example. From our data, we found that 40% of companies have strong company-wide communications based on their employees' feedback. Of those 40% who have strong internal communications, fewer, just 28%, have strong company communications and a strong recognition program. And even fewer have strong company communications, a strong recognition program, and great company-sponsored events, which is a shame because we see that employee satisfaction increases significantly when each type of initiative is added to the mix. So you go from 57% extremely satisfied at their company up to 72% when the 3 types of programs are offered together. The key, though, is making sure that each is strong and that you aren't spreading yourself too thin. And that's really the issue that I think is pretty prevalent based on what our research has revealed. So at the end of the day, what's this information mean for organizations who are looking to improve their engagement and retention, especially among high performers? Well, we've confirmed that when executed well, engagement initiatives do give employees compelling reasons to stay and to embrace their role and their organization day to day. It's not that anything we're offering is wrong per se, but there is something wrong with how many of us have gone about creating our engagement strategies. And that's because as much as we'd love the simplicity of a one-size-fits-all solution, needs are going to vary based on organization because of these intangible psychological forces or psychological benefits that ultimately drive engagement. So to improve engagement, we recommend that companies start with a careful evaluation of their current performance on the psychological benefits. Doing so is going to help you identify and target areas of strength and weakness, which ultimately can help you choose and tailor initiatives that will help you tap into the areas of opportunity and bolster those versus using your valuable resources on initiatives that might be targeted at supporting areas that are already strengths and don't actually need to be supported any further. Now, I know that I've covered a lot of information so far in the past 45 minutes or so, but I hope it's been as insightful for you as this research project has been for me. As I mentioned earlier, people are more prone, based on research and science, to remember the very last things that you say, and so I wanted to take a minute to just do a quick summary rundown of my 4 biggest aha moments that I had while working through this research project to ensure that it helps you see how maybe you can relate this to how you evaluate, manage, and optimize your engagement strategies moving forward. Firstly, functional benefits are important. I don't want you to think that they're not, but they're only about halfway of what you need to engage people. As I mentioned, our results suggest that they're considered cost of entry benefits, minimum requirements for satisfaction. And so as a result, most employees tend to be satisfied with these benefits, and few are very dissatisfied with them, especially compared to employee satisfaction with other kinds of engagement initiatives. So to really inspire and engage your people, you can't stop there. Next, despite increasing prevalence of wellness offerings as retention tools, they really aren't the fastest path for you to get there. Our research shows that wellness programs have just an indirect relationship to employee engagement. Making a bigger push for wellness programs will impact other drivers of retention, but it might not provide the results as efficiently as investing directly in initiatives that enhance the less tangible but still powerful psychological forces that drive engagement, the identity benefits and emotional benefits specifically. Speaking of identity benefits, they're the most crucial driver of engagement, and they can't be overlooked. It was so telling for me to see personal identity at the top of that relative importances chart for this project, and it should serve as validation to all of us that our focus in recent years on inclusion, instilling shared purpose, and creating deeper emotional connections with employees is spot on. But there's more work to be done. To optimize employee engagement, we need to leverage strategies that fuel employee self-esteem by instilling purpose and working toward an enhanced sense of belonging to a company and a culture that make them feel proud. These efforts drive those positive emotional experiences and ultimately employee engagement, retention, and advocacy. And finally, the reality slump is real. It's prevalent and it's pervasive, but so is the recovery. So we see that the slump and eventual recovery period occur both in overall employee satisfaction and in advocacy levels, but also across all of the psychological benefits, as you see here on screen. So what's happening? I think that there are actually a variety of underlying issues at play, but I'd like to zero in on one specifically, onboarding. I think a lot of good has come from the extra work and attention that organizations have put toward onboarding new hires. But I think we might actually run the risk of making the impact of the reality slump worse long-term with this. Your employees need support for these psychological benefits throughout their entire time with your organization to truly engage with and advocate for you. Employees are starting their new jobs on really positive notes, both because of the natural psychological highs they get, as well as the added support that companies are offering to provide them through those onboarding support measures. But what happens when that initial high and added support drops off? I think we see it plain and clear on screen. Now is the time to look at the improvements that have been made to the onboarding process and initiatives and find areas to replicate and enhance that support throughout the entire employee experience. This will help with those feelings of disconnect and alleviate some of the tension that's driving this reality slump to engage people long-term and help bring that dip back up. So at this point, I would love to open it up, Mike, to all of you on the phone and see what questions do you have? What can I provide further clarification on? You know, this is a topic I'm super passionate about, and I could only cover so much in this amount of time. So let me know how I can provide further clarification.
And we will turn to audience questions in just a moment. SHRM thanks ITA Group for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts. ITA Group provides innovative, integrated, and custom-crafted engagement solutions to align, motivate, and inspire your employees through employee engagement and recognition, employer branding, and employee events. ITA Group partners with organizations to create a continuous experience that connects with team members on a personal level. To learn how ITA Group can help you build an experience that motivates and engages your employees, visit itagroup.com. Okay, let's turn to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, and we'll start here. Audience member asks, what tactics would you recommend I use to better understand psychological benefit performance at my company?
Good question. I would stress first and foremost that it needs to come from your employees. I know people can be a little hesitant about surveying too often or tapping into employees too often, but you really will not get the perspective you need to understand where your strengths and opportunities are without going directly to them. It's not something that can be decided at a cross-functional roundtable by just a handful of people. I will note that ITA Group has developed an engagement diagnostic tool called EngageFX that's based on this research. We were able to take the most important questions that can help zero in on underlying issues to then provide a framework and a roadmap for where to focus moving forward if you would be interested in a more formal tool. Otherwise, you know, at the end of the day, I just recommend getting out there and talking to your people. You've got the high-level understanding of what it is that is important from a psychological benefit standpoint, and digging into some of those questions and those topics can be tremendously enlightening.
Another audience member asks, what did you find the most surprising result to be?
In some ways, I would say just how logical it was. That almost, in some ways, I wasn't surprised once I had a chance to process it and kind of internalize the findings myself. I think that a lot of it makes sense when you just put yourself in the shoes of the emotions that you feel and the experiences that you've had yourself over time. I will say I was pretty surprised to see that given the focus that so many organizations are putting on wellness, the difference in how employees perceive those programs and how maybe there's an opportunity to look at those a little bit differently in terms of how we're offering them for our people. So I'd say that was also a standout for me.
On the reality slump, an audience member asked, how much of the recovery after the reality slump do you think is due to turnover?
It's a good question. Especially knowing what we know about how frequently employees are turning over within organizations, I think certainly a little, some of the recovery period can be attributed to at some point those people who are just deeply unhappy will likely drop off. That being said, though, I guess I would challenge back to say, should all of them have been lost? Were there people who could have been saved if we were able to connect with them more effectively on that psychological level to really help them become their best for the organization? So 2 different angles on that question, I would say.
Continuing with our audience questions, one of our viewers writes, I love the research-driven approach. How would you suggest evaluating your engagement programs to determine which are the most or the least effective?
Yeah, I would go back to kind of what I said with the first question in terms of we have developed a tool that can help us dig into better understanding specifically for an organization where they're strong and where they're not. That helps by nature then do kind of an inventory of, okay, well, we know the common things that contribute to personal identity. If we know that we're doing really well there, let's identify those things that we know are contributing to that versus, if we're not doing so well on the functional benefits side, let's spend some time digging into what could be offered. What do we know is being offered in that space to kind of bring a little bit more focus to picking and choosing what it is that you offer, knowing that often we're all getting challenged to do more with less.
A couple of folks have written questions along this line. I'm curious to know how employee age or stage of life may have factored into the research findings.
Yeah, I really wanted there to be some significant fluctuations based on generation, especially I say this being on the tail end of the millennial edge, that we all love to blame them for a few things, and there was very little that I could blame them for. When looking at age, really the only psychological benefit that we noticed a significant variation by generation or by age was functional benefits. When we looked at emotional benefits and identity benefits, age was not a significant driving factor in whether or not they were performing well or not. Good question.
And in addition to age, some folks are asking about tenure. Audience member writes, I'm curious about why long-term tenure seems to increase engagement. Are companies changing what they do, or are the employees just resigned to the way things are?
I think it could be a little bit of both. And actually, I'll be honest, what we've seen sometimes too is you actually see another slump that can hit with longer tenured people if a company has made a lot of change because maybe they don't feel like it's the company they initially joined. So it's a little bit of that double-edged sword. I would say overall, though, it appears that the longer people stay with an organization, the more committed they get to it, the more they develop those social relationships, the more connected they are. Inherently, you would believe that, they get to a point where those functional benefits are strong. They feel like there's no reason that they would leave on that front. So I'm more inclined to believe that I think it's typically just at that point you've kind of found your fit, but that could be the idealist in me as well.
And we will close with this question. A couple folks asked if you found any differences in the results when dealing with remote employees.
You know, in the initial research panel that we fielded, we were not as focused on evaluating remote versus on-site workers because it was a cross-section of lots of different companies. I think that's something, though, that as you evaluate an individual organization or as we've helped consult with individual organizations, it's absolutely something to look into. I do think that inherently it is harder for emotional connection, social connection, and cultural connection to get really deeply rooted with remote workers unless companies are putting some pretty focused effort toward that type of outreach. And so I think that's a fascinating subset to definitely look into because I do believe there are some differences in terms of how these psychological benefits manifest for them. Great question. Thank you.
And with that, we are going to be bringing today's webcast to a close. Before we sign off, a couple of final thanks. First to our presenter, Christina Zurich from ITA Group. Thank you for the insight you shared today. And we want to thank our audience for joining in today and for choosing SHRM for HR webcasts. That concludes today's program.